Portugal's experience with democracy before the Carnation Revolution of 1974 had not been particularly successful. Its first republic lasted only 16 years, from 1910 to 1926. Under the Republic, parliamentary institutions worked poorly and were soon discredited. Political corruption and economic mismanagement were widespread. The 28th of May 1926 Coup d'État ended the First Republic and ushered in first the Ditadura Nacional and then the Estado Novo period. Background: the Salazar-Caetano era. The republic was replaced by a military dictatorship that promised order, authority, and discipline. The military regime abolished political parties, took steps against the small but vocal Marxist groups, and did away with republican institutions. In 1928 it invited University of Coimbra professor Antonio de Oliveira Salazar to serve as Minister of Finance. In 1932, he became Prime Minister. That year marked the beginning of his regime, the new state. Under Salazar, Portugal became, at least formally, a corporative state. The new constitution of 1933 embodied the corporatist theory, under which government was to be formed of economic entities organized according to the function, rather than by individual representation. Employers were to form one group, labor another, and their and other groups were to deal with one another through the representative organizations. In reality, however, Salazar headed an autocratic dictatorship with the help of an efficient secret police, the PIDE. Strict censorship was introduced, the politically suspect were monitored, and the regime's opponents were jailed, sent into exile, and occasionally killed. Portugal drifted and floundered under this repressive regime for several decades. Economic conditions improved slightly in the 1950s, when Salazar instituted the first of two 5-year economic plans. These plans stimulated some growth, and living standards began to rise. 1960s and the Colonial War. The 1960s, however, were crisis years for Portugal. Guerrilla movements emerged in the Portuguese African overseas territories of Angola, Mozambique and Guinea that aimed at liberating those territories from the last colonial empire. Fighting three guerrilla movements for more than a decade proved to be enormously draining for a small, poor country in terms of labor and financial resources. At the same time, social changes brought about by urbanization, emigration, the growth of the working class, and the emergence of a sizable middle class put new pressures on the political system to liberalize. Instead, Salazar increased repression, and the regime became even more rigid and ossified. Salazar incapacitated. When Salazar was incapacitated in an accident in 1968, the Council of State, a high-level advisory body created by the Constitution of 1933, chose Marcelo Caetano to succeed him. Caetano, though a Salazar protege, tried to modernize and liberalize the old Salazar system. He was opposed, however, by a group widely referred to as the Bunker, the old Salazarists. These included the country's president Admiral Americo Tomas, the senior officers of the armed forces, and the heads of some of the country's largest financial groups. The Bunker was powerful enough that any fundamental change would certainly have led to Caetano's immediate overthrow. As Caetano promised reform but fell into indecision, the sense began to grow among all groups, the armed forces, the opposition and liberals within the regime, that only a revolution could produce the changes that they felt Portugal sorely needed. Contributing to this feeling were a number of growing tensions on the political and social scene. Economic pressure. The continuing economic drain caused by the military campaigns in Africa was exacerbated by the first great oil shock of 1973. Politically, The desire for democracy, or at least a greater opening up of the political system, was increasing. Social tensions mounted, as well, because of the slow pace of change and the absence of opportunities for advancement. The decisive ingredient in these tensions was dissension within the military itself, long a bulwark of the regime. Younger military academy graduates resented a program introduced by Caetano whereby militia officers who completed a brief training program and had served in the overseas territories' defensive campaigns could be commissioned at the same rank as military academy graduates. Caetano's Portuguese government had begun the program in order to increase the number of officials employed against the African insurgencies, and at the same time cut down military costs to alleviate an already overburdened government budget. Spinola and Revolution. A key catalytic event in the process toward revolution was the publication in 1973 General Antonio de Spinola's book, Portugal and the Future, which criticized the conduct of the war and offered a far-ranging program for Portugal's recovery. The general's work sent shockwaves through the political establishment in Lisbon, as the first major and public challenge to the regime by a high-ranking figure from within the system. Spinola's experience in the African campaigns gave his opinions added weight. The book was widely seen, a correct assessment as it turned out, as the opening salvo in Spinola's ambitious campaign to become president. 1974 Coup. On April 25, 1974, a group of younger officers belonging to an underground organization, the Armed Forces Movement, overthrew the Caetano regime, and Spinola emerged as at least the titular head of the new government. The coup succeeded in hours with virtually no bloodshed. Caetano and other high-ranking officials of the old regime were arrested and exiled, many to Brazil. The military seized control of all important installations. Spinola regarded the military's action as a simple military coup d'etat aimed at reorganizing the political structure with himself as the head. A renovação in his words. Within days, however, it became clear that the coup had released long pent-up frustrations when thousands, and then tens of thousands of Portuguese poured into the streets celebrating the downfall of the regime and demanding further change. The coercive apparatus of the dictatorship, secret police, Republican Guard, official party, censorship, was overwhelmed and abolished. Workers began taking over shops from owners, peasants seized private lands, low-level employees took over hospitals from doctors and administrators, and government offices were occupied by workers who sacked the old management and demanded a thorough house-cleaning. Very early on, the demonstrations began to be manipulated by organized political elements, principally the PCP and other groups farther to the left. Radical labor and peasant leaders emerged from the underground where they had been operating for many years. Mário Soares, the leader of the Socialist Party of Portugal, and Álvaro Cunhal, head of the Portuguese Communist Party, returned from exile to Portugal within days of the revolt and received heroes' welcomes. Who actually ruled Portugal during this revolutionary period was not always clear, and various bodies vied for dominance. Spinola became the first interim president of the new regime in May 1974, and he chose the first of 6 provisional governments that were to govern the country until 2 years later, when the first constitutional government was formed. Headed by a prime minister, the moderate civilian Adelino da Palma Carlos, the government consisted of the moderate People's Democratic Party, the PS, the PCP, 5 independents, and 1 military officer. Beneath this formal structure, several other groups wielded considerable power. In the first weeks of the revolution, a key group was the National Salvation Junta, composed entirely of high-ranking, politically moderate military officers. Working alongside it was a 7-member coordinating committee made up of politically radical junior officers who had managed the coup. By the end of May 1974, these two bodies worked together with other members in the Council of State, the nation's highest governing body. Gradually, however, the MFA emerged as the most powerful single group in Portugal as it overruled Spinola in several major decisions. Members of the MFA formed the Continental Operations Command, composed of 5,000 elite troops with Major Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho as its commander. Known universally by his unusual first name Otelo, Carvalho had directed the April 25th coup. Because the regular police withdrew from the public sector during the time of revolutionary turmoil and the military was somewhat divided, COPCON became the most important force for order in the country and was firmly under the control of radical left-wing officers. Spinola formed a second provisional government in mid-July with Army Colonel Vasco Gonçalves as Prime Minister and 8 military officers along with members of the PS, PCP and PPD. Spinola chose Gonçalves because he was a moderate, but he was to move increasingly to the left as he headed 4 provisional governments between July 1974 and September 1975. Spinola's position further weakened when he was obliged to consent to the independence of Portugal's African colonies, rather than achieving the federal solution he had outlined in his book. Guinea-Bissau gained independence in early September, and talks were underway on the liberation of the other colonies. Spinola attempted to seize full power in late September but was blocked by COPCON and resigned from office. His replacement was the moderate General Francisco da Costa Gomes. Gonçalves formed a third provisional government with heavy MFA membership, 9 military officers in all, members of the PS, PCP and PPD. In the next year, Portuguese politics moved steadily leftward. The PCP was highly successful in placing its members in many national and local political and administrative offices, and it was consolidating its hold on the country's labor unions. The MFA came ever more under the control of its radical wing, and some of its members came under the influence of the PCP. In addition, smaller, more radical left-wing groups joined with the PCP in staging huge demonstrations that brought about the increasing adoption of leftist policies, including nationalizations of private companies. An attempted coup by Spinola in early March 1975 failed, and he fled the country. In response to this attack from the right, radical elements of the military abolished the Junta of National Salvation and formed the Council of the Revolution as the country's most powerful governing body. The council was made responsible to a 240-member radical military parliament, the Assembly of the Armed Forces. A fourth provisional government was formed, more radical than its predecessor, and was headed by Gonçalves, with 8 military officers and members of the PS, PCP, PPD, and Portuguese Democratic Movement, a party close to the PCP. The new government began a wave of nationalizations of banks and large businesses. Because the banks were often holding companies, the government came after a time to own almost all the country's newspapers, insurance companies, hotels, construction companies and many other kinds of businesses, so that its share of the country's gross national product amounted to 70%. The transition to civilian rule Elections were held on April 25, 1975, for the Constituent Assembly to draft a constitution. The PS won nearly 38% the vote, while the PPD took 26.4%. The PCP, which opposed the elections because its leadership expected to do poorly, won less than 13% of the vote. A Democratic right-wing party, the Democratic and Social Center, came in fourth with less than 8%. Despite the fact that the elections took place in a period of revolutionary ferment, most Portuguese voted for middle-class parties committed to pluralistic democracy. Many Portuguese regarded the elections as a sign that democracy was being effectively established. In addition, most members of the military welcomed the beginning of a transition to civilian democracy. Some elements of the MFA, however, had opposed the elections, agreeing to them only after working out an agreement with political parties that the MFA's policies would be carried out regardless of election results. Following the elections came the hot summer of 1975, when the revolution made itself felt in the countryside. Landless agricultural laborers in the south seized the large farms on which they worked. Many estates in the Alentejo were confiscated, over 10,000 square kilometers in all, and transformed into collective farms. In the north, where most farms were small and owned by those who worked them, such actions did not occur. The North's small farmers, conservative property owners, violently repulsed the attempts of radical elements and the PCP to collectivize the land. Some farmers formed right-wing organizations in defense of private land ownership, a reversal of the region's early welcoming of the revolution. Other revolutionary actions were met with hostility as well. In mid-July, the PS and the PPD withdrew from the Fourth Provisional Government to protest anti-democratic actions by radical military and leftist political forces. The PS newspaper Republica had been closed by radical workers, causing a storm of protest both domestically and abroad. The PS and other democratic parties were also faced with a potentially lethal threat to the new freedom posed by the PCP's open contempt for parliamentary democracy and its dominance in Portugal's main trade union, Intersyndical, or as it came to be known in 1977, the General Confederation of the Portuguese Workers' National Intersyndical. The United States and many West European countries expressed considerable alarm at the prospect of a Marxist-Leninist takeover in a NATO country. United States Secretary of State Henry Kissinger told PS leader source that he would probably be the Alexander Kerensky of Portugal. The result of these concerns was an influx of foreign financial aid into Portugal to shore up groups committed to pluralist parliamentary democracy. By the time of the hot summer of 1975, several currents could be seen within the MFA. A moderate group, the Group of Nine, issued a manifesto in August that advocated non-aligned socialism along the lines of Scandinavian social democracy. Another group published a manifesto that criticized both the Group of Nine and those who had drawn close to the PCP and singled out Prime Minister Goncalves for his links to the communists. These differences of opinion signaled the end of the Fifth Provisional Government, in power only a month, under Goncalves in early September. Goncalves was subsequently expelled from the Council of the Revolution as this body became more moderate. The Sixth Provisional Government was formed, headed by Admiral José Baptista Pinheiro de Azevedo. It included the leader of the Group of Nine and members of the PS, the PPD, and PCP. This government, which was to remain in power until July 1976, when the first constitutional government was formed, was pledged to adhere to the policies advocated by MFA moderates. Evolving political stability did not reflect the country as a whole, which was on the verge of anarchy. Even the command structure of the military broke down. Political parties to the right of the PCP became more confident and increasingly fought for order, as did many in the military. The granting of independence to Mozambique in September 1975, and to Angola in November, meant that the colonial wars were ended. The attainment of peace, the main aim of the military during all these months of political upheaval, was thus achieved, and the military could begin the transition to civilian rule. The polling results of the April 1975 Constituent Assembly elections legitimized the popular support given to the parties that could manage and welcome this transition. A coup by reactionary military units in November 1975, events which are referred to as the 25 de Novembro, marked the decline of leftist influence in Portugal. On November 25, under the pretense of a left-wing takeover of a radio station, Colonel Antonio dos Santos Ramalhoins declared a state of emergency and sent loyal commandos to seize the city of Lisbon. Revolutionary units within Lisbon were quickly surrounded and forced to surrender. About 200 leftists were arrested, and COPCON was abolished. The communists' ability to institute its goals had diminished without the support of the military, and people returned to their jobs and daily routines after 18 months of political and social turmoil. A degree of compromise among competing political visions of how the new state should be organized was reached, and the country's new constitution was proclaimed on April 2, 1976, paving the way to the termination of the provisional governments and of the ongoing revolutionary process. Several weeks later, on April 25, elections for the new parliament, the Assembly of the Republic, were held. These elections could be said to be the definitive end of a period of revolution. Moderate democratic parties received most of the vote. Revolutionary achievements were not discarded, however. The Constitution pledged the country to realize socialism. Furthermore, the Constitution declared the extensive nationalizations and land seizures of 1975 irreversible. The military supported these commitments through pact with the main political parties that guaranteed its guardian rights over the new democracy. For 4 more years,